On his birthday, my son looked at me across the table and said, "You never had any vision. You just built roads." The fork slipped from my hand and struck the plate louder than his words, but not louder than the silence that followed. Around him, cousins and relatives nodded with small smiles, the kind that hide behind politeness but secretly agree. The laughter that bubbled afterward was thin, almost nervous, but it still cut deeper than rage. Because what he said wasn't just a sentence. It was a verdict, a stripping away of years. I sat still, staring at the bread in my hands. Vision. That word had been my compass for decades, the invisible map behind every sketch, every meeting, every proposal that no one remembered. And now it was the weapon he chose. Not anger, not accusation, but dismissal. No vision. As if I had lived blind. As if 30 years of late nights with maps and pencils, of fighting for sidewalks where children could run, of sketching parks in the margins of agendas, had been nothing more than lines without purpose. Inside, memory pushed back. The first time I drew a street that curved toward the horizon instead of cutting it off. The time I argued for trees where they wanted billboards. The faces of neighbors who thanked me when benches appeared where there had only been concrete. But none of those images found words. My mouth betrayed me with silence. Silence, the same companion I had carried into every council meeting where my proposals were ignored, into every office where my reports were shelved under too idealistic. I looked at my son and wondered when the distance between us became so wide. Perhaps when he was small, I promised him parks and he only saw gravel. Perhaps when he grew older, he wanted skyscrapers, and I gave him bike paths. Perhaps he needed proof that vision was gold and glass, not shade and air. I wondered if he had ever noticed how the city bent around him differently than it had before, how the corners were softer, how traffic slowed near schools, how a bench waited for him at the edge of the river. He had grown up inside my work, and he could not see it. The laughter at the table subsided into casual chatter, but for me it was not over. His words stayed like a nail hammered through my chest. I forced myself to breathe evenly, to pass the dishes, to nod at questions about work. But the sentence was already lodged. No vision. It echoed down the long hallway of memory, where my sketches hung in the dark like ghosts no one believed in. And though my face betrayed nothing, something inside me began to shift, not to anger, not yet to defense, but to a quiet vow that one day the roads I had built would speak louder than his words. Friends, let me pause for just a moment. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening to this story from? Have you ever had a moment when someone close to you dismissed your life's work or failed to see what you carried inside? If you connect with this story, please subscribe and share this video. Your support helps us grow this channel and bring more stories to life. And now, we continue. Before his words, before the silence at the table, there was another table, a narrow kitchen table with a coffee cup balancing on a stack of bills and a stub of a pencil worn down to its last inch. I was young then, still restless, still carrying more dreams than proof. I spread out the old city maps and began to redraw them in the only place I had, on the back of discarded grocery lists, on the envelopes of overdue letters, on the thin brown paper my wife had saved from the market. Each line I drew carried more than geometry. A line could be a street softened with trees where none had been planned. A curve could mean fewer accidents where others had drawn only speed. A square of space could mean laughter instead of silence in a neighborhood where windows stayed shut. I wasn't drawing roads, I was drawing futures. I was sketching dignity into corners where the city had forgotten to look. I remember those nights as if they are still under my fingertips. The scratch of pencil, the sound of a clock echoing too loudly in the kitchen, the slow exhale of my wife as she slept in the next room. I was building a city that did not yet exist, a city where light moved differently, where children could walk without fear, where the ground itself was invited to carry more than traffic. I called it vision, but to others, if they glanced at all, it was scribbling. I carried those sketches in folders tied with string. Once, at a council office, I spread them out on a desk with more hope than sense. The officials looked at them and saw only obstacles. Too ambitious, they said. Too expensive. Too slow. The folders came home with me like defeated soldiers, their corners bent, their pages smudged with fingerprints that had turned them down. I placed them back on the kitchen table and traced the lines again, unwilling to let them die. Vision was not a word I used back then. It was something closer to a hunger, something that woke me when the world was still dark and made me scratch curves across old newspapers, as if my hand knew what my life had to prove. It wasn't pride, it wasn't even hope, it was need, the need to see beyond what already stood, to believe the ground under our feet could carry more beauty than we allowed it. And yet, in those early years, no one cared. The city carried on with its crooked roads and neglected sidewalks. My sketches piled higher. Relatives told me to get a real job. Friends asked why I wasted nights on paper that would never matter. Even those closest to me sometimes rolled their eyes at the maps I guarded like treasure. They could not see that those lines, fragile and unfinished, were already heavier than the weight of years. So when my son said I had no vision, he did not know that the word he chose was the very word I had lived by since those nights in the kitchen, bent over paper by the light of a dim bulb, hearing the world asleep while I whispered to the city with a pencil. He did not know that the vision he denied was already written, bridge by bridge, park by park, line by line, into the bones of a town that had once dismissed me, and that one day would celebrate what he could not yet see. At work, vision was treated like a nuisance. In meetings where the air smelled of stale coffee and paper ink, I would unroll my maps with the same careful hands that once held my children when they were newborn. I would explain the arcs of green space that could shield neighborhoods from heat, the sidewalks designed to invite strangers into becoming neighbors, the bridges that curved not only across water but across loneliness. I thought I was speaking of futures. They thought I was wasting their time. Too idealistic, one colleague muttered, already shuffling his notes for the next agenda item. Pretty drawings, another added, his smile sharper than the staple he slid into his report. They didn't even argue with me most of the time. They dismissed me with a shrug, the way you wave off a child asking for the moon. My words fell like rain on polished concrete, heard, maybe, but never absorbed. The projects we worked on never carried my lines forward. They were redrawn, shortened, chopped into smaller, profitable pieces. A park became a parking lot. A walkway became an extra lane of asphalt. A gathering square shrank into a narrow strip of benches between two glass towers. The heart of the plan was always the first thing sacrificed, because hearts don't pay dividends. And I nodded. I folded my maps into their folders and slid them back under the desk. I nodded because silence was easier than ridicule, because carrying vision in a place that only worshipped profit made every word feel like walking barefoot over glass. I told myself there would be another time, another chance, that maybe these colleagues were right, and I was too naive to believe people deserved more than walls and wires. But every time a project left the room without my lines, a piece of me left with it. I walked home through streets that could have been wider, safer, filled with trees I had drawn a dozen times over. I passed corners where I had once planned fountains or playgrounds, now occupied by billboards shouting advertisements into the faces of those who had no choice but to listen. And I knew that I had not been wrong. I had only been overruled. Sometimes the deepest betrayal is not an attack, but an erasure. They didn't fight me. They erased me. My ideas weren't debated. They were simply moved into the margins until they disappeared. And after enough margins, after enough silences, I began to wonder if perhaps I really had no vision. If perhaps my son's words years later were only the echo of this long, quiet dismissal. Yet even as I told myself to accept it, my hand never stopped moving. On scraps of paper, in the margins of reports, on the back of memos no one would read, I kept sketching. A street here, a tree there, a path where a wall now stood. Quietly, stubbornly, I refused to let the city die inside me, even as my colleagues laughed it out of the conference room. The meetings were never truly about the city. They were about numbers, graphs, projections that glittered on slides like promises carved in neon. Men in stiff suits raised their voices about progress, about development, about how many units could be squeezed into a block or how many cars could be funneled through a single artery of road. They spoke with conviction, with the kind of authority that silences dissent before it can even take a breath. I sat there, my notes trembling in my lap, the edges of my maps curling where my hands gripped them too tightly. My lines, those fragile arcs of parks, shaded corridors of trees, pedestrian crossings that treated people like more than obstacles, remained folded. No one asked to see them. No one wanted to imagine a city where breath and light had equal weight with glass and steel. To them, my silence looked like agreement. But it wasn't agreement. It was the lonely weight of knowing I was the only one in that room fighting for air. Every so often, I would raise my voice, timid at first, suggesting that maybe more space should be left open for families, that maybe sidewalks were as vital as roads, that children needed safe paths to schools. The room would pause, not out of respect, but out of that brief discomfort people feel when someone says something out of tune with the chorus. Then the laughter, or worse, the patronizing smiles would come. "Lovely idea," someone would say, already moving to the next agenda item. But we need to be realistic. Realistic meant profitable. Realistic meant concrete piled upon concrete, glass reflecting glass, until the city became a mirror maze that forgot its people. And I would sit back down, feeling smaller each time, feeling as though my maps were not blueprints, but fragile prayers, destined never to be answered. The word vision became their insult for me. "He's got vision," they would mutter, meaning impractical, meaning naive, meaning blind to the hunger of investors. And maybe I was blind, but I refused to see a city only as a marketplace. I refused to erase the faces of children running through green spaces, the elderly resting under trees, neighbors meeting not in malls, but in plazas. Those images stayed with me, even as my colleagues spoke louder, filling the room with statistics that smelled like cement dust. The loneliest part was not the laughter. It was the way my own voice began to wither. I stopped trying to interrupt. I stopped unrolling the maps. I stopped pressing my case when the table was already set against me. I learned to swallow my words until silence became a second skin. But even in silence, I could feel the city pulsing beneath my ribs, begging for air, begging for life. Each meeting ended the same way. Applause for the loudest voice, decisions signed in haste, the future sealed in documents that made no room for dreams. I walked out of those rooms into streets that looked more and more like prisons, taller walls, narrower sky, and I carried with me the sickening certainty that my city was slowly suffocating, one meeting at a time, and that I was the only one in those rooms who still heard it gasping. They never approved the grand plans. They never wanted the sweeping maps, the corridors of light, the riverside walks that I dreamed of carving into stone. But I learned to move in smaller gestures, almost invisible, the way water finds cracks in rock and slowly, patiently, remakes the landscape. A bench at a corner, that was all I could win. Slipped into a budget no one bothered to read carefully. "Just a bench," they said, as if comfort were nothing but wasted wood. Yet weeks later, I walked past and saw an old woman resting, grocery bags at her feet, her breath steadying before she rose again. She caught my eye and smiled. No report could have justified her smile. No ledger could have measured its worth. But I knew, in that moment, the city had inhaled. A tree planted beside a bus stop. Again, a line in a report no one noticed.
To them it was decoration. To me it was shade. Years later, children would cluster beneath its branches, waiting for the bus, laughing as the leaves brushed their hair. Strangers would stand closer, talk softer, because the tree gave them cover from the sun's unblinking stare. One tree was not a forest, but it was a promise, and promises have roots.
A small square between buildings. Just an empty plot no developer wanted. I argued for paving it, simply, with room for children to play, a fountain trickling at the center. They shrugged. It cost little, so they allowed it. Months later I passed by in the evening. Neighbors were gathered there, mothers talking while their children darted in circles, a man playing a guitar softly at the fountain's edge. The city, which my colleagues thought was concrete and commerce, was suddenly alive with voices rising, mingling, becoming music. And I stood in the shadow, unseen, but I felt something inside me loosen. This was vision, even if they never called it that. It was never the wide boulevards or shining towers that taught a city to breathe. It was these small mercies, these gentle interruptions to the march of profit. The benches, the trees, the squares, tiny stitches that kept a wounded place from tearing open completely. To others, they were afterthoughts, footnotes at best. But to me, they were seeds, and seeds are stubborn. They wait for years in silence, then one day crack open stone. Sometimes, late at night, I wondered if these fragments were enough. If my life's work would be remembered only as the man who pushed for benches and trees, while others carved towers into the skyline. But then I would remember the smile of the woman at the bench, the shade of the tree over children's heads, the sound of laughter in the square. I would remember that life hides in the details, not the monuments. And though my son once said I had no vision, I knew the truth was more fragile, more quiet, more enduring. Vision is not always a monument standing tall against the sky. Sometimes, vision is the shadow of a tree on hot concrete, a place to sit when the world has asked too much, a patch of ground where strangers become neighbors. These were not small things. They were the beginning of justice for a city that had forgotten how to care for its people. The council meetings could wound me, but never as deeply as the words spoken within my own walls. I had learned how to let colleagues laugh, how to let them call my plans childish or unprofitable. I had learned to sit silently while they stamped their approvals on faceless glass towers, while my maps were buried in dusty drawers. But when my own son, flesh of my flesh, looked across the table and said, "You never even had a career. Your projects are sidewalks and shrubs. That isn't vision," it was colder than any dismissal, sharper than any bureaucrat's stamp. His words landed not like a passing insult, but like a judgment, final and merciless. My fork hovered above my plate, untouched, while his laughter mixed with the clatter of dishes. To him, I was a man who had traded greatness for benches and bushes, someone who had wasted years tending to the details no one else valued. And in his eyes, those details did not add up to a life worth respect. I wanted to tell him about the woman who sat on that bench and caught her breath. I wanted to tell him about the child who laughed beneath that tree. I wanted to remind him that greatness is not only measured in skyscrapers and highways, but in the quiet mercy of a city that remembers its people. But I didn't. My tongue pressed against silence, the way it had in countless meetings before. Except, this silence was heavier, because it grew in the space between father and son. I looked at him and saw not malice, but blindness. He had grown up in the city I'd stitched together with my hidden victories, the shaded streets, the small squares, the gentle places where strangers met and became neighbors. He had never known the harshness of the city without those things. He thought they had always been there, like air, like gravity, and so he dismissed them as nothing. It was a peculiar kind of betrayal. Not theft of ideas, not rejection in a boardroom, but the failure of recognition from the very bloodline I had hoped would see. A stranger's laugh I could bear. My son's scorn cut deeper than any ridicule I had endured in public. He was not mocking my projects. He was mocking my life's work, my hours in dim basements, my nights drawing maps no one wanted to read. He was mocking the rhythm of my heart disguised as pencil lines on old paper. That night, after the plates were cleared and the house fell quiet, I sat alone in my study with those same maps spread across the table. Faded pencil strokes, smudged corners, coffee stains marking years of persistence. To others, these sheets were trivial. To me, they were bones and blood. And yet my own son saw only shrubs and sidewalks. I felt the weight of something irretrievable, that a man can spend his life building, not just cities, but bridges of love and legacy, and still stand accused of having no vision by the one voice he longed to hear differently. Betrayal at work had made me stronger. Betrayal at home made me ache in ways strength could not cure. And yet, beneath that ache, something else stirred. A question, like a stubborn ember. What if time itself would prove me right? What if the sidewalks and shrubs were the foundation of a vision that only patience could reveal? The memory still stings like the bite of hot wind on bare skin. I had drawn it carefully, the plan for a park that was meant to breathe life into a tired corner of the city. Curved paths that invited wandering instead of rushing, trees that would one day lace their branches into green canopies, benches shaped for comfort rather than formality, and a fountain that would hush the noise of traffic with its gentle insistence. It wasn't just a park, it was a pause for the people, a pocket of grace in a city that was choking on its own ambition. But when the plan reached the contractors' hands, it never stood a chance. They smirked at the sketches, flipping pages as though brushing crumbs off a table. One of them tapped the page with a pen and said, "Do you know how many cars we could fit here?" Another chuckled and added, "Trees don't pay rent, asphalt does." And in their laughter, I heard the verdict. They paved it over. The fountain became a drainage grate. The planned circle of trees became white parking lines on hot tar, where children might have run barefoot in the grass, sedans now baked under a sun that had nothing to soften it. At first, no one noticed the loss. The city cut the ribbon on the new lot, shaking hands in photographs that would yellow in office frames. Cars filled the space, and for a few weeks the officials congratulated themselves on their efficiency. But summer came quickly. The air grew heavier. The shade that had been promised on my map never arrived, and the people who parked there complained of the heat. Mothers rushed their children across the open ground, desperate to escape the burn of concrete under small shoes. Old men who once gathered in the nearby street had nowhere to sit. Still, no one connected their discomfort to the plan that had been laughed away. I walked past it often, my steps echoing in the emptiness, where there should have been laughter and leaves. Every time I saw the sea of cars, it was like standing over a grave, knowing what could have lived here, what could have grown, if only vision had outweighed profit. But the truth was bitter. They didn't just reject my park. They erased it so thoroughly that people couldn't even imagine what had been stolen from them. Failure in private hurts, but failure made public, transformed into asphalt and metal, is a wound that reopens every day. And it wasn't just the contractors' laughter that haunted me. It was my own son's voice echoing behind theirs. You never had vision. In that parking lot, I heard both sentences at once. Yet even as I stood there, the heat pressing down like judgment, something deeper than humiliation stirred in me. The park had not been a mistake. Its rejection had not been proof of its weakness. The misery of that space, the complaints of those who used it, were proof of what I had tried to build. The failure was not in the dream. It was in the blindness that could not see it. And so, though the lot remained, I kept the map. I kept every rejected sketch, every curled page of pencil marks. Because one day I believed the city would choke enough on its own concrete to look back and wonder where the air had gone. And then they would find my maps waiting, quiet, patient, and undeniable. There are nights that stretch longer than a man's patience, and yet they become the only nights that matter. I would sit at the kitchen table when the house had gone quiet, the hum of the refrigerator my only companion. The lamp leaned low, spilling a circle of gold across the paper, and in that circle I built a world no one asked for and no one believed in. I drew streets where children could ride their bicycles without dodging engines. I shaped blocks where people met one another on shaded corners, not in the exhaust of traffic lights. I bent the lines so that trees could stand where towers wanted to grow, because I believed, foolishly, stubbornly, that a city should feel like home, not like machinery. The papers piled up, more fragile in concrete, but more honest too. Each sketch carried not the arrogance of profit, but the patience of breath. I wrote notes in the margins like promises whispered to the future. Benches here, water there, sunlight breaking through at this corner at exactly 4 p.m. It was not a plan. It was a prayer. No one clapped for these maps. They were not displayed in glossy brochures or pitched to investors. They lived in drawers, in folders, in the shadow of cupboards, where even my family forgot they existed. But I carried them in my head through every dull meeting, every dismissal, every smirk at the council table. They said vision belonged to others, men with titles, men with budgets, men who spoke louder than I could. Yet, in the solitude of my kitchen, I discovered that vision survives without applause. I remember once, in the middle of winter, tracing the outline of a square where an old factory stood. I imagined tearing down the soot-stained walls and replacing them with a library, a playground, and a row of lanterns that would glow like constellations for people walking home at dusk. My pencil shook from the cold, but the drawing was steady. That night I fell asleep at the table, forehead pressed to paper, and when I woke with the imprint of my own lines on my skin, I thought, at least the city is closer to me than it was yesterday. Sometimes persistence looks like madness. Even my wife sighed when she found me hunched over maps again, whispering, "Why do you bother? They never listen." But I couldn't stop, because it wasn't about being heard in that moment. It was about making sure the vision existed somewhere, even if hidden, so that when the world finally realized it couldn't breathe, it would have lungs ready, drawn in ink and hope. And so the nights went on. Quiet wars, fought with graphite and erasers, with rulers and stubbornness. No headlines, no praise. Just a man, a table, and a city that lived only in sketches, waiting for its chance to step into daylight. Years passed the way seasons do, quietly, almost without permission. Concrete cracked, roots pushed their way upward, and suddenly a tree that was once thin as a broomstick stood broad enough for a child to hide behind. I would walk through streets I had sketched a lifetime ago and see pieces of my stubborn lines breathing in brick and soil. Families lingered on benches I had fought for when they told me benches were a waste. Children ran across squares where I had insisted there must be open space, even when developers swore that every meter should be sold to cars. And slowly, without fanfare, the city began to whisper back to me. An old woman sat beneath the canopy of young maples and said to a neighbor, "This shade is a blessing." A teenager leaned his bicycle against a lamppost and laughed with friends at a fountain that once lived only in my pencil strokes. A mother spread a blanket on the grass of a small square, her baby asleep under the same branches I had fought to plant when others wanted asphalt. No one knew the origin of these comforts. No one traced them back to the solitary nights at my kitchen table or the countless meetings where my voice had been drowned out. To them, the city was simply growing kinder, softer in its edges, more human. But I knew better. These weren't accidents. They were scars of battles I had lost on paper, but somehow won in soil and stone. And yet there was a strange loneliness in that recognition. People praised the spaces, but not the vision. They spoke of good planning as if it had fallen from the sky, as if no one had sweated over maps, been laughed out of rooms, or called small-minded for insisting that streets should have trees. My son, who once rolled his eyes at my projects, now brought his own children to these places, never realizing that the playground where they climbed was one I had drawn by candlelight when he himself was still small enough to carry. I would walk past these scenes quietly, not announcing myself, not demanding acknowledgement. I felt both proud and wounded, like a ghost watching people live inside the dream he built but never signed. My city was alive, but my name was buried beneath it. Still, a part of me cherished that anonymity. The proof of my vision was in the laughter of children echoing between the buildings, in the lovers meeting under lamp-lit trees, in the way even the tired workers paused to breathe in the square before heading home. Every smile was a confirmation, every gathering a quiet vindication. They didn't know it was mine, but I did. And perhaps, I told myself, maybe that was enough. But deep inside, a fire refused to go out. Because justice is not just about what survives. It is about being seen. And though the city now carried my lines, my name was still absent, erased by silence and indifference. It was not yet justice. It was only the first sign that justice might one day arrive. It happened in a room I almost didn't enter. The city had organized a lecture at the university about sustainable growth, and I was invited not as a speaker, not even as an honored guest, but as an afterthought, one of many planners asked to sit in the back rows, nod politely, and keep silent while new voices filled the stage. I almost declined, thinking of all the times I had been dismissed, all the meetings where my words were treated as background noise. But something drew me there, maybe habit, maybe the stubbornness that had kept me sketching parks when the world wanted parking lots. The hall smelled of chalk and dust, lit by the pale rectangles of late afternoon. Students filled every seat, their notebooks open, laptops glowing, faces turned forward with a hunger I recognized, hunger for a future not yet poured in concrete. I sat in the shadow, my own notebook resting quietly on my lap, its corners frayed, its lines worn thin. When the young lecturer, a student not much older than my son had been when he first mocked me, took the stage, his voice trembled with the courage of someone speaking truth against the weight of tradition. He didn't show glass towers or profit margins. He spoke of benches, of walkable paths, of neighborhoods designed for children and old men as much as for cars. He spoke of the kind of vision that breathes, that gives dignity to small places. And then, as if it were nothing extraordinary, he turned a slide and said my name. He pointed to an aerial photo of a square I had once fought for, one they had nearly paved over. "This," he said, his voice stronger now, "isn't just infrastructure. This is the soul of the city." And it began with a sketch drawn decades ago. I felt the air leave my chest. For a moment I thought I had imagined it, that the years of silence had finally blurred into some cruel hallucination. But then he lifted one of my old diagrams, retrieved from some forgotten archive, edges yellowed, and laid it beside a photo of the park alive with families, children chasing pigeons, old men playing chess under shade trees. "Vision," he said, pausing long enough for the word to settle. This was vision. The hall was silent. Not mocking, not indifferent, silent in reverence. Students leaned forward as though hearing a sacred name. Some scribbled notes furiously. Others simply stared at the picture, at the simple park I had once begged them to consider. For the first time, my lines were not called naive. They were called necessary. And I, an old man with thinning hair and a heart scarred by ridicule, sat in the back row, trembling. I didn't clap. I didn't raise my head. I let the silence carry the weight of the moment, heavier than applause. For in that single sentence from a student, "This is the soul of the city," the wound my son's words had carved began, ever so slightly, to close. It was not full justice. It was not yet redemption. But it was the first time my vision was seen not as a failure to dream, but as the dream itself. The envelope arrived with the same formality as bills and official letters, thick paper, embossed crests of the town, my name typed neatly on the front as though I were just one of many names copied onto a long list. Inside, a card announced the celebration of 30 years of urban planning and development. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the words, the paper heavy in my hands. A celebration, a milestone, a gathering of officials and voices who had spent decades claiming credit for work they didn't draft, speeches rehearsed for cameras while my pencil scratched unseen in the dark. I thought I knew what it would be. More polished suits, rehearsed applause, men with titles longer than their contributions. They would speak of innovation, progress, growth. Always growth, like a weed through cracked pavement. And me? I would sit in the back row, invisible, the same way I had been in every meeting, my name left out, my labor folded into someone else's headline. I nearly threw the invitation away. My fingers hovered over the trash bin, but something, habit, stubbornness, maybe the small echo of that student's words in the lecture hall, stopped me. The phrase lingered in my head. This is vision. I remembered how the silence of that room had felt, how for the first time I had been seen. And though part of me whispered that this celebration would only reopen old wounds, another part refused to yield. If the city was going to celebrate 30 years of planning, then they would be celebrating 30 years of my work, whether they said it aloud or not. That night, I could not sleep. The invitation sat on the nightstand, its edge catching the lamplight. I thought of all the nights like this one, 30 years of them, spent bent over sketches and maps while others dreamed. The parks that shaded children now, the benches where the lonely found company, the streets where neighbors crossed paths instead of rushing past each other, those had begun in silence, in the solitude of my table, and the silence had always been enough for me, or so I told myself. But when my son's voice replayed in my memory, "You have no vision," I felt the weight of the invitation deepen. What if he came to the celebration? What if he sat in the audience, smirking as officials ignored me yet again? Would it prove him right? That his father had labored for nothing? That vision belonged only to those with microphones? Or could there be a chance, the smallest chance, that justice might arrive not as thunder, but as acknowledgement in front of the very people who had denied it? Placed the invitation back in its envelope, careful, as if it were fragile. My hand shook, not from weakness, but from the gravity of a choice. Attend and risk humiliation once more. Decline and let the story of the city be told without me. One final silence layered over all the others. I folded the card and whispered to myself in the stillness, "I will go." Not because I believed they would speak my name, but because my lines already lived in the streets outside their halls. And whether they admitted it or not, they were about to celebrate me. The square swelled with voices long before the speeches began. Flags rippled from lampposts, children darted through jets of water arcing from the fountains, and elders leaned on canes beneath the broad canopy of trees. Every corner of the plaza seemed alive, and in each detail I saw the ghost of a line I once drew alone on a kitchen table. The arc of stone benches meant to face the setting sun, The fountain designed not just for beauty, but for play. The row of trees chosen because they grew roots deep enough to survive storms, but spread branches wide enough to shelter strangers. I stood at the edge of the crowd, invisible among them, listening to laughter echo against buildings I had once sketched in silence. A woman carried groceries across the square, pausing to rest on a bench I had fought to keep in the plan, after others called it wasted space. Children squealed as they darted barefoot through the fountain's spray, the same fountain once dismissed by the committee as too sentimental. Old men played chess in the dappled light beneath the trees that had nearly been traded for asphalt. The city breathed, and though no one said it, I knew it was because my pencil had once refused to surrender. Yet no one spoke my name. The stage was already set with a line of officials in dark suits and polished shoes, their smiles rehearsed, their speeches typed. They looked out at the crowd as though the city were their reflection. They shook hands, posed for photographs, lifted children onto their laps for the cameras, all while speaking about progress and leadership and vision. That word, vision, rang sharp in my ears. I thought of my son at the dinner table, laughing with his fork raised, calling me blind to the future. Now the officials borrowed that same word, wrapped it in empty praise, and tossed it to the crowd like confetti. And yet, around me, the city itself told another story. A mother held her baby close and smiled when she saw the wide, shaded walkway that made it easier to wheel her stroller. A group of teenagers leaned against the fountain, trading stories while their reflections trembled in the water I had once calculated to flow at just the right height to catch the sun at noon. Couples lingered in the plaza's open center, not rushing through but staying, claiming the space as their own. They did not need a program to tell them whose work it was. The proof surrounded them. Still, I felt the old ache of erasure, sharp and familiar. Applause rolled like a tide across the crowd whenever a name was spoken. Names of men I remembered as skeptics. Names of officials who had once dismissed my drawings as pretty but impractical. Now they basked in the glow of 30 years, their words rising above the square like scaffolding erected too late, after the foundation was already laid. I kept my silence, but inside me it churned. Not bitterness, not anger, something deeper, heavier. The kind of sorrow that comes from being both present and absent at once. A little girl stumbled and fell by the fountain. I stepped forward, helped her up, and she smiled, wet curls clinging to her cheeks. She ran back to her family without ever knowing that the stone she slipped on had been set at the angle of my hand all those years ago. I returned to the edge of the square, my heart a storm wrapped in quiet. The gathering was meant to honor a city's vision, and yet the vision itself stood unspoken, folded into my chest. They had not named me, not yet, but the city had. Every child's laughter, every old man's game, every couple's slow walk through the square, whispered the truth no microphone dared to say. And though no one else seemed to notice, I felt it then. Justice often arrives long before it is announced. The applause had begun to feel like thunder that never reached me, a storm circling the horizon but never breaking above my head. I had already braced myself for the evening to pass the way so many years had, others speaking, others praised, my work swallowed whole by silence. Then the mayor walked forward, his suit too crisp, his tie too bright, his voice prepared for another speech I expected to slide past me like rain on stone. He adjusted the microphone, looked out at the crowd, and for a moment his words caught in his throat. And then he said it. Not the usual line about progress, not the empty word development. He said, "Tonight we celebrate the man whose vision built this city." The square seemed to still. My chest tightened, my breath caught, because the next sound was my name, carried across speakers, rolling into the night air, sharp and undeniable. For the first time in decades, my name was not whispered, not ridiculed, not ignored. It was honored. The crowd erupted, not immediately, but like a wave discovering its own power. Some clapped out of ceremony, but others turned to look. to see who among them was being spoken of. I felt eyes land on me, one after another, recognition dawning as they began to trace the truth backward. The benches, the trees, the plazas, the fountains, and then me, standing quietly at the edge, the so-called man without vision, the one who had sketched all of this long before it stood in stone and steel. My son was there, his arms folded, his smirk already fading. He had called me small, called me blind, laughed when I spoke of future neighborhoods filled with light. But when my name echoed against the walls of the square, he could not stop it. His face flushed, his eyes dropped, and for once he had no sentence sharp enough to cut through mine. Justice didn't roar. It settled on my shoulders like a mantle I had carried unseen all along. The mayor continued, but his words blurred. I heard fragments, decades of work, a city that breathes, a vision for generations. But more powerful than the speech was the silence between phrases, filled with faces turned toward me. A woman mouthed thank you. An older man nodded as if he had always known. Children climbed onto their parents' shoulders to see the man whose name had just been spoken. I had been erased for years, and now the square itself seemed to rewrite me back into the story. I did not walk forward. I did not need to. The air itself bent. The applause thickened, and for once it was not for the officials in their suits, but for the quiet lines I had drawn in lonely kitchens, the plans I had refused to abandon. My hands trembled not from weakness, but from the overwhelming weight of being seen at last. Recognition is not always loud, but it is always irreversible. Once the truth is spoken, it cannot be unsaid. That night, the city no longer belonged to the speeches of men who had dismissed me. It belonged to the echoes of my pencil strokes, to the vision no one had believed in until it rose up around them, undeniable. And now my name was bound to it, carved not in ridicule but in gratitude. The crowd was still clapping, their hands striking together like waves breaking on stone. But through it all, my eyes found only one face, the one I had feared and longed to read more than any other. My son stood there, rigid in the middle of the square, his hands unmoving at his sides while the applause thundered around him. He did not smile, did not join the others, did not force a performance of joy, but his eyes betrayed him. They searched for me through the blur of bodies. And when they found me, they did not look away. For the first time in years, there was no coldness in them, no sharpness honed into contempt. Instead, there was something harder to face: recognition. A dawning realization that every word he had thrown like a stone, no vision, no career, no future, was crumbling in the light of what stood around him. The fountains sprayed arcs of water that glittered under the night lamps. Children chased each other along the plazas. Old men leaned on canes beneath the shade of trees I had once drawn with a shaking hand and a dull pencil. It was all around him, undeniable, alive. He was standing inside the very vision he had mocked, breathing the air it had made possible, and he knew it. I felt no triumph, no gloating. The victory was too heavy for that. I saw his chest rise and fall, his lips part slightly as if he might say something, but no words came. What could he say? How do you take back years of dismissal, years of slicing phrases meant to cut me down to nothing? Sometimes silence is the only apology left. For a moment I thought of the boy he had been, the boy who had run down streets without trees, who had once told me he wished for shade where there was none, who had laughed when I showed him sketches of playgrounds because he could not yet imagine them real. I had carried his words for years, carried his disbelief like an extra stone in my pocket. And now, as he stood with his arms heavy at his sides, I saw that stone shift. I saw the weight fall from me and onto him. The mayor kept speaking, names and dates, but I heard nothing but the space between my son and me. It was not warm, not yet, but it was different. He could not undo the past, but his eyes admitted what his mouth never had. I was not the small man he believed me to be. My vision had built the very ground beneath his feet, and his silence now was the loudest thing he had ever given me. I did not nod, did not step closer. This moment needed no movement. It was enough to stand there, to let him see me without defenses, to let him feel the truth press against him from every corner of the city I had shaped. Justice had not come in anger or in court. It had come in the soundless space between father and son, where the weight of disbelief had finally collapsed into recognition. And in that silence, deeper than any applause, I knew that something inside him had cracked open. Not yet forgiveness, not yet love, but the first fragile root of respect. Weeks later, the celebration ended. The speeches faded, and the bunting was taken down. But what remained was not silence. It was permanence. One morning, as I walked along a familiar boulevard, I saw the city workers lifting a new street sign into place. The metal gleamed in the early light, the paint fresh and unmarred, and when they stepped aside, I read it. My name. For a moment my legs trembled beneath me, as if the earth itself had shifted. I had spent a lifetime being told I had no vision, no worth beyond a stack of discarded maps. Yet here it was, my vision carved not into paper, but into the very air people breathed, the ground they crossed, the lives they lived. Everywhere I turned, I saw pieces of myself. The children chasing one another across a square that once lived only in my midnight sketches, their laughter echoing against the facades I had once traced with nervous hands. The benches shaded by trees that had been little more than pencil strokes in a notebook, now sheltering old women sharing stories and bread. The fountains lifting water skyward, falling back in rhythm with the heartbeat of the city, reminding me of nights I had doubted if water and air could ever be part of a plan, if softness could survive concrete. People moved without knowing they carried me with them. A man paused in the shade of an oak and sighed with relief. A young couple found their first kiss on the bridge I had once designed in secrecy, when no one wanted to hear about pedestrian pathways. Workers walked to their offices along streets where trees caught the smog and gave back breath, and none of them knew they were inhaling the stubbornness of one man who refused to erase his lines. That was justice, not loud, not vengeful, but steady, woven into every step of every passerby. My son walked those streets too. I knew it. Sometimes I thought of him pausing, reading my name on a corner plaque, his silence folding inward. The boy who once told me I had no vision now lived inside the vision he could not deny. He might never say the words, but the city spoke for him, louder and more faithful than his mouth ever had, and that was enough. The city carried what he could not. The streets taught what his pride resisted. I did not crave applause anymore. I did not need headlines or titles. I had something larger, heavier, quieter. The truth laid in stone, soil, and shadow. A justice that did not shout, did not punish, did not demand, but simply existed, undeniable. Justice that lived in fountains and oak roots, in the laughter of children, in the whispered thanks of tired workers, in the kiss of dusk against a skyline that would not have been, had I listened to those who told me I had no vision. And so as I stood at the corner of the street that bore my name, I understood. I had not only built a city, I had built proof. Proof that vision is not measured in applause, nor in wealth, nor in recognition, but in the way strangers unknowingly walk through your dream and find it sturdy enough to call home. No one could erase it now. No one could say again that I had no vision, because my vision had become theirs, and it would outlast us all.